Despite major civil rights victories in the 1950s and 1960s, freedom for Black Americans was far from complete. Supreme Court rulings and historic legislation promised equality under the law, but in the streets of America's cities, reality told a different story. In neighborhoods shaped by poverty, overcrowded housing, and failing schools, hope often felt distant. Jobs were scarce, public services were weak, and encounters with law enforcement were too often marked by fear rather than protection. For millions, civil rights existed more on paper than in daily life. This contradiction defined an entire generation. While the nation celebrated progress, Black communities were still trapped in cycles of economic hardship and social exclusion. Young people grew up surrounded by frustration, watching promises made in Washington fail to reach their blocks and doorsteps. The question became impossible to ignore. If equality had already been won, why did injustice still feel so deeply rooted? Out of this tension emerged voices unwilling to wait patiently for change. Some believed survival itself required courage, organization, and a readiness to defend dignity by any lawful means necessary. It was in this climate thick with anger, hope, and urgency that a new kind of leadership began to rise. Not polished politicians or distant reformers, but figures shaped by the same streets, struggles, and fears as the people they spoke for. This is where our story begins, not with comfort, but with confrontation, not with silence, but with a refusal to accept a broken status quo. At the center of this moment stood a young man who believed fear was a weapon used against the oppressed, and that the first step toward freedom was to reject it entirely. If stories of courage, resistance, and unfinished justice matter to you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who want to understand history beyond the headlines. By doing so, you help keep these stories alive and ensure they are never forgotten. The tension that had been building for years did not fade with speeches or signatures on historic documents. Instead, it hardened. In cities like Oakland, the gap between what America promised and what Black communities experienced grew impossible to ignore. Every day brought fresh reminders that progress had limits, and patience, once preached as a virtue, was beginning to feel like a trap. When Malcolm X was killed in 1965, it sent a shockwave through Black America, not only because a powerful voice had been silenced, but because his death symbolized how dangerous it was to challenge the foundations of the system too directly. For many young people watching from the streets, it confirmed a painful truth. Relying solely on appeals to conscience had not been enough. It was in this moment of reckoning that Huey P, Newton and Bobby Seale crossed paths in a way that would reshape the direction of Black political struggle. They were not distant theorists or comfortable leaders speaking from behind podiums. They were students, workers, and products of the same neighborhoods where police patrols felt more like occupying forces than sources of safety. Their conversations were shaped by what they saw: daily men stopped without explanation, families living one paycheck away from disaster, and communities expected to endure injustice quietly in the name of order. Newton, intensely curious and self-taught, spent long hours studying law, philosophy, and revolutionary history, searching for answers that made sense of what he had lived. Seale, more outwardly expressive and deeply connected to the rhythms of the street, understood how ideas had to be spoken in a language people recognized as their own. Together, they began to ask a question that few were willing to voice openly at the time. What if the problem was not a lack of laws, but a lack of power to enforce dignity on the ground? Their answer took form in 1966 with the founding of the Black Panther Party. From the beginning, it was shaped by clarity rather than confusion. The party did not exist to provoke chaos, nor to replace one form of injustice with another. It was built around the principle that communities had the right to protect themselves within the bounds of the law. especially when protection was consistently denied. This belief in self-defense was not about aggression, but about survival, about standing visible and informed in a society that often treated Black lives as invisible. At the heart of the organization was the 10-point program, a document that read less like a manifesto of anger and more like a list of unmet promises. It demanded decent housing, meaningful employment, access to education that told the truth, and freedom from economic exploitation. Each point reflected a lived reality, not an abstract ideal, and spoke directly to people who had grown tired of being told to wait for conditions to improve on their own. What made this moment different was not only what Newton and Seal believed, but how they chose to act. They understood that political consciousness did not grow in isolation, and that dignity could not be postponed until some undefined future. By organizing openly and grounding their ideas in everyday experiences, they offered a vision of resistance that felt immediate and personal. For many, this approach transformed frustration into purpose and fear into resolve. The Black Panther Party emerged, then, not as a sudden eruption, but as the natural response to years of ignored suffering and broken assurances. It was the continuation of a struggle that had never truly paused, only changed its voice. In linking theory with action and rights with responsibility, Newton and Seal gave shape to a movement that refused to ask quietly for justice and instead insisted on being seen, heard, and respected in the present. The ideas that Huey P. Newton would later articulate with such force did not emerge in isolation or appear suddenly in moments of political confrontation. They were rooted deeply in his childhood, shaped long before he ever spoke of power, rights, or resistance. Oakland was not simply the place where he grew up. It was the environment that trained him, tested him, and stripped away any illusions about safety or fairness at an early age. For a young Black boy coming of age there, the streets were not a metaphor. They were a daily reality that demanded alertness, resilience, and the ability to confront fear before it consumed you. Poverty defined much of Newton's early life, not as an abstract condition, but as a constant presence. His family moved frequently, chasing stability that always seemed just out of reach. Money was scarce, meals were modest, and uncertainty hung over everyday decisions. Yet, within this hardship, Newton absorbed a powerful lesson. Survival was not guaranteed by obedience or silence. It required awareness, discipline, and a refusal to be diminished by circumstance. The struggle to simply live with dignity planted the first seeds of his later political thinking, long before he had the language to describe it. The streets of Oakland reinforced these lessons with brutal clarity. Violence was not unusual, and respect was often the thin line between being left alone and being targeted. Newton learned quickly that fear invited harm, while confidence, even when fragile, could serve as protection. He became known for confronting challenges head-on, not because he sought conflict, but because retreat carried its own dangers. These early encounters shaped his understanding of power as something that operated immediately and physically, not just through laws or speeches. At home, Newton witnessed another form of resistance, quieter but no less influential. His father stood as a figure of uncompromising pride, a man who believed that self-respect could not be negotiated away, regardless of how limited one's options were. In a society structured to deny Black men authority and autonomy, Newton's father insisted on standing his ground, even when doing so carried risk. This example left a lasting impression. It showed Newton that resistance did not always look dramatic, but it always required courage. From this foundation, Newton developed an instinctive distrust of systems that demanded submission without offering protection in return. He did not grow up believing that institutions existed to serve him or people like him. Instead, he saw how rules could be enforced selectively, how power often flowed in one direction, and how those without knowledge of their rights were most vulnerable. These observations would later drive his determination to study law and political theory, but their emotional core was formed much earlier, through lived experience rather than books. As Newton matured, the lessons of his childhood began to align with the broader political awakening taking place around him. The gap between promise and reality that defined black urban life was not theoretical to him. It was personal. When he later spoke of self-defense, dignity, and the necessity of organized resistance, he was not adopting an ideology for its own sake. He was articulating a worldview forged through years of navigating an environment that rewarded strength and punished hesitation. This background helps explain why Newton's leadership carried a particular intensity. His fearlessness was not performative, nor was it born from blind aggression. It was the result of a lifetime spent understanding that survival, whether personal or collective, required readiness. So the militant edge of his politics did not emerge from abstract radicalism, but from the conviction that dignity could not depend on goodwill alone. In this way, Newton's childhood in Oakland did more than shape his character. It provided the emotional and moral framework for everything that followed, binding his personal history to the larger struggle he would later lead. What began on the streets of Oakland did not remain there for long. The ideas that Huey P, Newton and Bobby Seale had shaped through lived experience and hard study traveled quickly, carried by word of mouth, newspaper images, and the growing sense that something new was taking form. As the Black Panther Party took root, it spoke directly to people who had spent their lives being talked about, but rarely spoken to. Young men and women from neighborhoods across the country recognized themselves in its language and its urgency. The movement expanded not because it promised comfort, but because it acknowledged reality and offered a way to confront it. The Panthers' visibility was impossible to ignore. Their presence during police encounters, carried out within the limits of the law, yet firmly assertive, challenged a long-standing imbalance of power. For communities accustomed to being watched, stopped, and questioned without explanation, this form of resistance was both unsettling and empowering. It signaled that accountability did not belong exclusively to authority, and that knowledge could be used as a shield. This aspect of the party attracted intense attention, praise from some, alarm from others, and relentless scrutiny from institutions unaccustomed to being observed so closely. Yet focusing only on confrontation misses the deeper story of why the Black Panther Party spread so rapidly. Alongside its insistence on dignity and lawful self-protection, the organization built something far more enduring, systems of care where none had existed. These efforts, known as survival programs, were not symbolic gestures. They were practical responses to daily needs that had long been ignored. In cities where children went to school hungry, the Panthers organized free breakfast programs, understanding that learning was impossible on an empty stomach. In neighborhoods without adequate medical access, they opened health clinics and offered screenings, treating wellness as a collective responsibility rather than a privilege. Legal aid followed the same logic. Many families lived in fear of systems they did not fully understand, vulnerable not only to injustice, but to confusion and misinformation. By offering guidance and education, the Panthers sought to replace fear with knowledge, empowering people to navigate institutions that had previously seemed impenetrable. Each program reinforced a central belief: survival was political, and meeting basic needs was itself a form of resistance. As these initiatives spread, so did the party's influence. Offices opened in cities far beyond California, from the West Coast to the Midwest and the East. Each chapter adapted to local conditions, but the underlying purpose remained consistent. The Panthers were not simply protesting what was wrong. They were demonstrating what could be built in its place. This combination of direct challenge and constructive action gave the movement its distinctive character and broadened its appeal beyond those drawn solely to confrontation. For many supporters, this dual approach resolved a long-standing dilemma. It showed that demanding change did not require abandoning care, and that strength could coexist with compassion. The image of the Panthers standing firm against mistreatment was inseparable from the quieter scenes of volunteers preparing meals, organizing clinics, commissions classes, and working long hours to keep programs running. Together, these efforts conveyed a powerful message. Dignity was not an abstract concept, but something that could be practiced daily. The rapid national growth of the Black Panther Party reflected a hunger for this balance. People were searching for movements that addressed both the immediate pain of their lives and the broader structures that produced it. By linking resistance with service, the Panthers offered a vision that felt complete rather than fragmented. Their expansion was not driven by slogans alone, but by tangible proof that communities could organize, protect themselves, and care for one another, even in the absence of institutional support. In this way, the party's rise marked a turning point in the struggle it emerged from. It transformed anger into structure and despair into action, weaving together confrontation and compassion into a single narrative. The Black Panther Party did not simply spread across the nation. It embedded itself in the daily rhythms of countless communities, leaving a legacy defined as much by what it built as by what it challenged. As the Black Panther Party expanded, and its influence reached far beyond the streets where it was born, Huey P. Newton found himself confronting questions that went beyond immediate survival and local injustice. The same mind that had once been focused on the realities of Oakland's neighborhoods began to widen its lens, searching for patterns that connected the struggles of Black Americans to forces operating on a global scale. This evolution did not represent a rejection of the party's original mission, but an attempt to deepen it, to understand why inequality seemed so persistent even when movements achieved visibility and momentum. In the early years, Black nationalism offered Newton a language of pride and self-determination that resonated deeply with communities long denied both. It affirmed identity and insisted that liberation could not depend on approval from those in power. Yet as Newton studied history and followed world events, he began to sense the limits of a framework that treated oppression as something confined within national borders. The forces shaping life in Oakland, he realized, were tied to economic and political systems far larger than any single city or country. Newton's growing engagement with international struggles sharpened this awareness. He watched liberation movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America challenge colonial rule, often facing overwhelming odds, similar to those confronting marginalized communities in the United States. These movements were not isolated episodes. They were responses to a global order structured around concentrated power and resource extraction. For Newton, this parallel was impossible to ignore. The same logic that justified domination abroad, he believed, also shaped inequality at home. From this realization emerged a shift toward internationalism, a perspective that saw Black freedom as inseparable from the freedom of others worldwide. Newton argued that injustice could not be fully confronted if it was understood only in racial or national terms. Instead, it had to be examined as part of a system that linked economic control, political influence, and military strength across borders. This thinking pushed the Panthers to express solidarity with struggles beyond the United States, broadening their sense of purpose while also inviting controversy. Newton's most ambitious theoretical step came with his idea of intercommunalism. Rather than viewing the world as a collection of independent nations, he suggested that powerful states had eroded true sovereignty by extending their influence into the economic and political life of other societies. In this view, what appeared to be nations were, in practice, interconnected communities shaped by a dominant global power. For people living under these conditions, whether in American cities or distant regions. The experience of marginalization shared common roots. Intercommunalism offered Newton a way to explain why traditional revolutionary models often failed when applied directly to the United States. Unlike classical colonial settings, oppression within America operated through complex networks of consumption, culture, and control that blurred the line between center and periphery. By reframing communities as the primary units of struggle, Newton emphasized local organization while acknowledging global constraints. Liberation, in this sense, required cooperation across communities rather than reliance on national revolutions alone. This intellectual evolution reflected Newton's constant willingness to rethink his assumptions. He did not cling to ideology for its own sake, nor did he treat theory as separate from lived experience. His ideas shifted as circumstances changed, shaped by victories, setbacks, and the expanding reach of the movement he helped create. For supporters, this flexibility demonstrated depth and honesty. For critics, it introduced ambiguity and raised questions about direction. Yet for Newton, adaptation was not weakness. It was necessity. By linking local struggles to global systems, Newton sought to give meaning to the sacrifices already made and to chart a path forward that did not depend on illusions of isolation. His theory of intercommunalism attempted to bridge the gap between the streets and the world, between immediate needs and long-term transformation. In doing so, he left behind a body of thought that continues to provoke debate, reminding later generations that resistance is not static and that understanding power requires both grounded experience and a willingness to see beyond familiar borders. Despite the extraordinary energy and vision that had fueled the Black Panther Party, no movement exists in isolation, and the pressures of both external forces and internal struggles began to weigh heavily on its members. As the 1970s progressed, chapters across the country faced relentless surveillance, harassment, and disruption by government agencies determined to weaken their influence. Programs that had brought communities together were interrupted, leaders were jailed or targeted, and the daily work of sustaining survival initiatives became an increasingly difficult task. These pressures exposed tensions within the party itself, as differing strategies, personalities, and visions of the future clashed under the stress of constant scrutiny. Huey P. Newton, once the fearless architect of the party's ideology, faced challenges of his own. His personal life was marked by turbulence, including legal battles, health struggles, and the psychological weight of leading a movement that was constantly under attack. The same intensity and uncompromising determination that had made him such a force also made him vulnerable to burnout, mistakes, and isolation. As internal debates and external attacks mounted, the cohesion that had made the Black Panther Party a national presence began to erode, and by the early 1980s, its influence had significantly diminished. Yet even as the party's structures weakened, the ideals it had championed, the insistence on dignity, community care, and active resistance to injustice, remained vivid in the memories of those it touched. Tragically, Newton's life ended violently in 1989, cutting short the journey of a man who had become a symbol of both revolutionary courage and human complexity. His death was a shock, yet it crystallized the paradox of his legacy. A figure capable of inspiring thousands through vision and action, yet also deeply human, vulnerable to the same pressures, flaws, and tragedies that affect anyone engaged in high-stakes struggle. The story of Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party is therefore not one of simple triumph or defeat, but of a movement that reshaped the conversation about justice, equality, and community in ways that continue to resonate decades later. As we reflect on this history, it is clear that the lessons of Newton's life extend beyond his era. They challenge us to consider how courage and compassion, strategy and care, Resistance and creation can coexist. They remind us that social change is never linear, never easy, and never guaranteed. Yet it is sustained by those willing to confront fear and build structures that nurture and protect their communities. Newton's story encourages us to think critically about power, responsibility, savior, and the enduring need to hold institutions accountable, while also valuing the human connections that make collective action possible. Thank you for taking the time to engage with this story, to consider the complexities of struggle and leadership, and to reflect on the ongoing relevance of the Black Panther Party's vision. If you found this journey through history insightful, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. By doing so, you help support content that explores important stories like this one, keeping the conversation alive and ensuring that lessons from the past continue to inspire future generations. Your support allows us to continue uncovering stories of courage, resilience, and transformation. And we appreciate every viewer who joins us in remembering and learning from the lives of those who fought for justice.